Hey there, my name is Charles Amat, and welcome to Part 3 of Test-Driven Development in Unity, a series where I'll be demonstrating test-driven development in Unity by developing a heart-based health system. Without further ado, let's get started. We'll start Part 3 by again removing items from our to-do list that we completed in the previous video. I've looked up argument out of range exception. It is the exception that is thrown when the value of an argument is outside the allowable range of values as defined by the invoked method. In our case, negative numbers are outside the allowable range of values. We'll push forward by completing the next item on our to-do list, which is to implement some sort of a heart container. Now we'll need a heart container class, and the only way to do this in TDD is to create a failing test, which is exactly what we'll do here. In Part 2, I was asked a question about how to set up NUnit and unit testing within Unity. Well, luckily for us, the Unity test runner uses a Unity integration of the NUnit library, which means as long as we mark our tests with the appropriate attributes, as defined in the NUnit documentation, our tests will run in the test runner just fine, without any prior setup. One gotcha to this is that editor tests must be placed within a folder called editor. There are two types of tests in Unity, the play mode tests and the edit mode tests, but I'll get into that in a later video. For now, let's use the organizational hierarchy we've been using to create a test that will drive us to create the heart container class. The first test will be a base case that will pass 0 into replenish and do nothing to affect the image.fillAmount. A couple of commenters have pointed out that I'm coupling myself too tightly to Unity by testing against the UI image's fillamount property. While this may be the case, it was a compromise I was willing to take in order to keep these videos focused on test-driven development. In the near future, I should introduce a new property to the heart class that abstracts away image.fillamount, and then refactor my tests to check against that, instead of the low-level details of Unity's UI image class. Another thing I'll have to deal with is how I instantiate classes under tests and their collaborators. You'll probably start to notice that the heart container test's instantiation logic is a little more complicated than it was for the heart tests. Also, the collaborators used in each heart container test differ from each other just a little bit. This will make it more difficult to refactor out duplication in the instantiation logic. But don't worry, we'll deal with that in the future with data builders. Now take a look at heart container and what I'm doing here. One of the great things about test-driven development is that you don't necessarily need to know your design up front. While you certainly can plan ahead, a lot of the times you're creating your design with your tests. In this case, I don't have a heart container. I'm going to allow the tests to drive that creation, the creation of heart container. But I also don't know what the heart container's constructor looks like, or what properties it has, or even what all of the methods will eventually look like as a part of its API. But I do know that heart container's job is to control a list of hearts, or a set of hearts. So, in the case of this test, I know that I'm going to need to pass a list of hearts in the constructor. Technically, it could be through a setter method, but in this case, I'm allowing my need for this list to be available to be guided by this test, and I'm going to just stick it into the constructor. But that's the great thing. We can refactor that later, and eventually, maybe heart container list of hearts will be instantiated via a setter. Or, if it becomes a mono behavior, maybe it'll have to be set via the editor. But we don't know those details right now, and that's okay. So I just wanted to make a point that TDD is great for flexibility of design. And in the end, it typically leads to better design, a more decoupled design. And that's not only because the tests require you to build very small decoupled classes as a part of creating testable classes, but also because usually what feels right as you're developing tends to be what's right in the end. That's not always the case, but and that's pretty anecdotal. But I have found from experience that most of the time I get the design pretty close on the first shot. Of course, take all that with a grain of salt. Your mileage may vary, and I might just be getting pretty lucky. So we've completed the base case here, and I'm going to come up with a nice name for it, but First, I try to remove some perceived duplication, and it gets me into a little bit of trouble here. I remembered from heart tests that I was able to remove this instantiation duplication that happened over there with my setup attribute over this method that I like to call the before every test method. The problem is heart tests only had one collaborator, where the heart container tests are going to have to contend with multiple collaborators, each in their own state. Now, these first couple of tests are very simple. Our heart containers are only going to have a list of one heart, and I'm only going to be manipulating this single heart. But eventually, my heart container is going to manipulate multiple hearts every time I call replenish. Same for deplete. It's not going to be able to be the same sort of duplication removal as I use for heart tests. I'm going to need something more sophisticated. And it's not only that, it's different. I basically just kind of jumped the gun. I mean, if you've ever read Refactoring, the Refactoring book by Martin Fowler, he has this, the rule of 3, which says the first time you do something, you just do it. The second time you do something similar, you wince at the duplication, but you do the duplicate thing anyway. And the third time you do something similar, you refactor. In this case, I just went for the refactor before I had any duplication whatsoever. And so I left this in so you can kind of see me fumble around and figure out what I need to do and learn. It's like a cautionary tale. What I end up doing here is just kind of settling on this one image property on the class that I will use in a couple of my tests. But eventually, we're going to remove all that in favor of something more sophisticated. But moving forward, I need to come up with a name for this first base case. So I'm going to reference my heart test, and this is a case where I actually can reference my heart test because in this sense they are similar. 0 sets image with 0 fill amount to 0 fill, and in the next test it's going to be 1. I'm going to have a heart container with a single heart, and I'm going to pass replenish a 1, and I expect that first heart will be replenished by 25%. Here I am referencing the heart test just to make sure I got my names correct, and this is fine, all for the sake of consistency. And I'm going to move forward. Now you'll notice that my my heart container, well, first let me just mention that I'm rerunning my tests to make sure that all this fumbling around didn't break anything. And after Unity compiles, we'll see that, yes, I have not broken anything. The test is passing for the reason I expect, and we should be good to go. Now you'll notice the heart container, I did nothing. I didn't even store the hearts that were passed in on the constructor. And this next test is what's going to drive that part forward. And we're going to get a very, very forced implementation that's just simply going to make this test pass. And we'll see how we build on that. So the next test, like I said, I'm going to pass 1 to replenish, and I expect that my single heart will be filled by 25%. And I will check that by making sure that image's fill amount was increased by 25%. So I'm continuing to do assert first, and I mentioned that I was going to move away from that, but I believe I continue doing this for a while. And I'm doing assert first here because I know that in the next couple of tests, I'm really not going to know how to begin per se. I'm going to have less of an idea, whereas so far the part 1 and part 2, the heart tests, have been pretty straightforward. And I even received a couple comments mentioning, hey, why do you need to do why do you need to do test-driven development for this? This is so straightforward. But now you'll see as we start moving into territory that isn't as straightforward, I'm really gonna have to think about it, and I'm not gonna have names for these tests, and I'm gonna have to move from the assert backwards in order to come up with the full details of the test. So we have our next test, and again, it's very simple. I have a single collaborator, and I use that private image variable just to do the instantiation and move it forward. But now I'm going to need to get more sophisticated with the heart container, and I'm going to have to introduce a class level hearts list variable. And in order to make this pass, I'm going to do something very a very dumb implementation, which is I'm going to call the first index on the list, and I'm going to call replenish on that heart, and that's going to get my test to go green. Now, one thing I do, a sin I commit here as far as test-driven development goes, is that I should have refactored out that hard-coded 0 at this point. And I could have done that by looping through the hearts. But you'll see here with this next test that I'm going to do that anyway. So hopefully that will earn me some forgiveness. Now, this is a case where with this next test, I'm not 100% sure how I want to proceed. So I don't know what to call the tests exactly. I do know that I need to amp things up, and I'm going to need a heart container that has multiple hearts on it. So I'm going to go ahead and call replenish with a 1, and I expect that the image in question is going to be increased by 25%. But again, I need to have a heart container that has 2 hearts. So what I'm going to end up doing is I'm going to have one of those hearts, the first of the hearts, be a full heart, and the second of those hearts to be an empty heart. And that empty heart is the one that I'm actually going to test against. Because if you will imagine for a moment a heart container with 1 full heart and 1 empty heart, when you call replenish, you'd expect that that empty heart would be filled. So there's a little bit of ordering here that's required, and as you can see in my test, the first heart is going to be this is going to have this image that I'm going to define within the test, and the second heart that's passed is going to contain the heart that I've instantiated on the class, and that's the one that I've been kind of using as my target, and I'm going to try to continue to use as my target. But the first image that I pass, I'm going to actually set it up with a fill amount of 1. And this is going to cause my test to fail, because right now the implementation of my replenish method is that it's going to get the first index of my list, and it's going to call replenish on that 1. And that's going to cause this to fail, because we'll see that when I assert the fill amount of this target heart, it's going to continue to be 0. Also, before I run the test, I try to come up with a name, and this is, for me, I'm very particular with the naming conventions of my tests, so I kind of agonize a little more about it than I should. I like what I end up with here. At first I say empty hearts are filled first, but I didn't necessarily want it to be about order, so I'm just gonna say that empty hearts are replenished. I'm not in this particular test. I'm not concerned about the order. All I care is that I've got 1 full heart and I've got 1 empty heart, and I'm going to say that the empty heart needs to be replenished, and that's in that case. And we'll see that this will cause the test to fail, which will drive the implementation forward. So right now I'm kind of looking over it, making sure that everything is the way I need it to be, the way I like it, and we'll pop over to Unity, let it compile, and now we've got it failing. I just make sure that it's failing for the reason I expect, which is I expect the fill to be 25%. It's not. So how do we go about doing this? We have to do this in the simplest way. We have to get this to pass in the simplest way. And the way that I come up with is that I'm going to loop through all the hearts in the list, and I'm going to call replenish on each one. Now, of course, this is not appropriate for a final implementation, but this will get this next test to pass, and it's going to lead us into the next test, which will also contain multiple hearts. But each heart will now have a different state, and that different state is what I will be testing upon. So that was enough to get it to go green, and now I can move on, like I said, to a more sophisticated test. The purpose that this next test will serve will be to prove that we are distributing the number of heart pieces across all the hearts in the heart container, starting with the first non-empty heart. If you imagine, for a simple case, a heart container with 2 hearts, where the first one is full and the second one is empty, then we'd want to start filling on that second heart. In the case of this test,
we're going to have a heart container that has 2 empty hearts in it, and we're going to just assert that when we pass 1 into replenish, that the second heart is still empty, because that 1 heart piece would not have been enough to fill the first heart and spill over into the second. So it's just a very simple test. The problem I'm going to face is that the heart class currently doesn't expose enough information in order to accomplish this. I'm going to need to know for each heart how much it is currently filled, how many heart pieces any one particular heart currently has. And we'll see that we get into the algorithm and I begin to write it, and I'm going to have to stop. Now in this case, I could leave my test as failing and I could hop on over to heart. What I end up doing though is deleting this test. Realistically, I could comment it out, but I just decided to delete it. And I go over to heart and I create some new tests in order to expose this new field. This new field will actually be a calculated one, so I will have to write tests for it, and that's something we're going to cover in the next video. But for now, you'll see that I kind of just fumble around trying to figure out what I need to do, and in a moment when I'm done, you'll see that I have 2 hearts, both completely empty based on that image fill amount, and my target heart, the heart that I'm going to assert against, will be the second one in the list. So I get that test going. It's a pretty solid test, a little ugly in its instantiation, but like I said, we'll get to that. And it fails. It fails for the reason I expect. Because we're looping through all of the hearts, that second heart in the list, the one I'm asserting against, gets filled to 25%. Number of heart pieces gets passed to the heart.replenish method of every heart. So I'm going to skip ahead here because it's pretty painful, but we'll see that in the next video. I move forward by introducing a variable that's going to expose what I need in order to make this pass, in order to make this algorithm function. So we'll skip ahead and we'll take a look at our to-do list next. So as I mentioned before, now I'm going to need to add an item to my to-do list that just says, expose the current heart pieces, current number of heart pieces on the heart class, and that's just because in order to make my heart container a little more intelligent about how it fills itself, it needs to know about hearts. So I add that, and oftentimes when I get stuck like this, sometimes it's good to push yourself forward, and this is really just a me thing, and it might be a you thing. Try it out if you'd like. In this case, I make a new to-do item called rename image to target in heart container test. It's really just kind of like a throwaway task. It's something that I wanted to do, and it's gonna make me feel good to do it, to get something nicked off the to-do list that I set out to do, that I had in my mind. And even if it's a small psychological purpose, I think it's valuable, and I think that sometimes, while maybe not in this case, sometimes doing those small tasks push you forward and get the juice flowing just enough to help you move forward, maybe help you think of something that you hadn't before. So here I use refactor, or resharper's refactor, to change the name, and really it was easy as that. So you'll see that now target is what I'll be testing against, and this is something that I just started using kind of recently, like the target. I'm not sure if I like it. It's not 100% explicit to me. I think I kind of like to know what it is that I'm testing, what I'm starting against. But in this case, I have multiple images in some of these tests, so it's good to know at a glance, a little bit easier to tell which is the target that I'm setting the state of and testing against. So I don't know, a little psychological thing, maybe a little psychological trick. Take it with a grain of salt and give it a shot for yourself. But in a way, to me, it's kind of like getting up from your desk and going for a walk, or rubber ducky debugging, or whatever productivity tools you use when you're sitting and your head's down and you can't see how to move forward. Sometimes it's really best to just get up and take a breather. And for me, if I don't want to get it from the keyboard right away, sometimes knocking off a silly task like this is my breather and my getting up and walking away from the desk. So that's it for this video. We have our goal for the next one for part 4. If you stuck around this long, I really do appreciate it, and I really would appreciate a comment, like, and subscribe if you like this series. And any feedback I've been receiving, I've been trying very hard to listen to it and to implement it. So thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next part.